In Newport, Rhode Island. It's kind of fun for me to do this from afar. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you all in person, but I was delighted when John called me up some months back and asked if I could share my interest and some information on my model yacht collection, which is largely geared towards vintage catamarans, which are somewhat unusual. So I appreciate everyone's attention, and I'm happy to share with you kind of my interest and how I got into catarans. You guys can see my screen, okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
So you're seeing on the screen sort of the two primary catamarans in my collection. And I'm just going to sort of step through a little bit of the history of the background on real-life catamarans, and then how that stemmed the flow over into pond yachts, and then how these two catamarans sort of fell into my lap. So thank you all for listening. So the history of catamaran sailing in real life here in America really dates back to 1876 when Captain Nat Airshoff, you all certainly know him, who was busy building conventional racing boats, monohulls, in Bristol, Rhode Island, was always tinkering around and fiddling with unique, innovative ideas that he had in his head. And one of them was to conceive and build a 25-foot racing catamaran, which he did without much fanfare, sailed it with his blind brother, Lewis, from Rhode Island down to New York Harbor, where they were having a centennial regatta in 1876. And it was a well-publicized regatta. There were many local New York racing boats, including at the time a lot of sandbaggers, which were really considered nimble, fast, tough-to-beat racing boats in and around New York Harbor. And sure enough, Captain Nat and his brother showed up. It was a two-lap race around the southern part of New York Harbor. And halfway through the race, the winds were very, very light. And people were looking at this very odd boat saying, that thing is just crazy, it doesn't stand a chance. But then the wind picked up, and it picked up some more. And one by one, Captain Nat in this catamaran called Amarilla started picking off the competition one by one. And by the time the race finished, he was 7 minutes ahead of the first place and over 20 minutes ahead of the second boat. And at the time, yachting was a really high-end sport in New York. All the newspapers started covering this, and they were all just completely ecstatic over what this strange, unique vessel was. Nobody had seen anything like it before. Captain Nat, during all this fanfare, for a while decided to stay silent. His lips buttoned up tight and easy.
Talk to him. Tell him we lost him. TJ, we lost your voice.
Decided to reveal a few of his secrets and thinking to the press, as the press just kept asking more and more questions. And I'm not going to read through this paragraph in detail, but essentially his thinking was, look, I want to have a craft that I want it to be really powerful. I want a really powerful sail plan, lots of sail area. And the way that you typically make a sailboat be able to carry a lot of power is by making the boat very, very wide. You give it lots of form stability. But inherently that adds lots of wetted surface, which slows the boat down. So you really don't have much of a gain there. And so Captain Nat hypothesized in this little sort of cartoon diagram on the bottom. If you can imagine taking a conventional hull, you see where my cursor is, and imagining making it wide to add stability, but starting to tug up the keel towards the waterline.
TJ, pause a minute.
Slide 3, I was talking about Captain Nat, and his idea was, well, if we start tucking the keel up towards the waterline, above the waterline, we start to cut back down on wetted surface, and the next thing you know, you just keep following that progression to the point where you split the hull actually in half. You push out those two half hulls further outward, you get lots of form stability and very low wetted surface. And so that's inherently his conceptual thinking in a catamaran. Let's go to slide 4.
Okay. We're there.
So he actually, in 1877, applied for and received a patent on his design. And you're actually looking at, although this is colorized, you're looking at the actual drawing, and one of the drawings that was included in the U.S. patent. And in the patent he made, it was a long list of descriptions in what went into his catamaran, but there were several key points.
Okay,
So, again, this is just another drawing from Captain's patent, and again, you can see the central hulls, many different components and cross arms connecting them, each with flexible joints, and then also here, this sort of elliptical floating cockpit that sort of flies above the water. Next slide.
okay,
That's a actual photograph, which is the model that was submitted with the patent. So back then, when you applied for a patent, we actually provided U.S. Patent Office with a model of what you were proposing. And that's what he submitted, and this still exists. This is in the possession of the Air Show Museum up in Bristol. And again, you'll see there the beginnings of these cross-connected arms, these sort of pivoting joints, the stays that help hold things not only in place in the rig, but sort of these tension stays that hold the truss system together. Next slide.
okay,
So after the success of Amaryllis, and Captain Ned beginning to, with a smile on his face, publicize some of the technology behind these catamarans, interest was very, very good, and he started getting orders for this. So he and his brother and his family started producing these things. This is a yacht that they built in 1878 called the John Gilpin. It's essentially an evolution of what he had in Amaryllis, but incorporating a lot of the same common features. Next slide.
okay,
Slide 8 is a lines plan of the John Gilpin. Again, you can see how long and slender these hulls are, and this echoing theme of the flexible cross members between them. And this drawing is very helpful because if you look at the back there carefully, you can see a tiller and a tiller connected to a series of linkage rods. And although the tiller itself is deflected to a certain angle, if you look carefully, because of the offset in those linkage rods, the two rudders are turning a different rate of deflection. So in this case, imagine that you're going a port rounding around a mark to the port side of the port hull. The inside hull has to turn a tight circle. It needs a larger rudder angle deflection. And the starboard hull is going around a much wider circle. It needs a much more gradual rudder deflection. And so that's what you get with this linkage. And if you actually turn the tiller the other way, the exact same thing happens on the other tack. Next slide.
okay,
So through the period of 1877, 78, right through 1880, the Hershaw family built a whole series of these catamarans, each of the same thing, each slightly unique in size and form for individual customers. Caratella, Arian, Teaser, John Gilpin. They really were quite successful. They were really enjoyed not only for racing boats, but very easy to sail cruising boats to take, family members, girlfriends, wives out on the boats. And Captain Nat joked that he was selling these for the price of $750 to $1,000. But he joked one time that he really thought if he could do it again, he'd up the price to $1,200 and make a little more of a profit. Next slide.
okay,
So right up through the late 1880s is when sort of the peak phase of this Hershaw period of catamarans was at its highest. And then Hershaw and his family got really wrapped up in a lot of the big America's Cup yachts that they started building, which you guys I'm sure know quite a bit about. It kind of sat in the shadows up until 1933, when the Hershaw Boat Building Company built a replica of the very first Amaryllis. this is my yacht that, as you see, it actually hangs like a beautiful cathedral ceiling in my house, and these things just fly overhead. And here's this hair shop influenced catamaran that, again, I think it was built, my best guess, 1900-ish, or maybe 1933, as influenced by Amaryllis too. I believe it was built in Long Island, New York, and the reason why I know that, I'll show this at the very tail end of the presentation, there's actually a clone to this yacht that I and some mid-stays attached to the top of that. Next slide.
Okay.
Again, just flying around the boat here. Again, we're looking at the port hall, and you can see how not only there are shrouds going up to the rig, but on that end fitting plate that is on the outboard end of that central strut, there are sort of these diamond stays that run horizontally, connecting to the bow and connecting to the stern, that central truss, to help hold everything in column, so to speak. Again, let your eyes take in the cockpit. There's some pretty detailing just for fun here on the cockpit seats and a little cockpit hatch. I think the craftsmanship here is really excellent. Next slide.
Okay.
Looking here at the truss system again, and we're just going to zoom in. So that central truss, you can see now a little better the fittings that are on the very outboard end of that central truss, which is where the hull attaches. There's actually some springs in there. We're going to see that in a shot in just a second. And you can see how these stays sort of crisscross back and forth. A lot of the stays as this exists are slack just from age. And when this would have been racing in a pond or in its counterpart in real life, all those stays would have had much more tension than that. You can also see on the jib boom in white, there is a little jib sheet that can sheet in and out. And the way back aft is the main sheet that goes in and out as well. Next slide.
Okay.
So here we're a little bit lower, and now you can again see the central strut. We're beginning to see some of the features of little dark mechanical fittings in between those tiers of struts, and in a minute we'll see some springs in there. You get a really nice view of kind of the forward strut attaches to that little stud that comes up towards the bow, and there's a little hook and eye joint in there, and the shroud attachment. And you get a nice sense here too of how the strong back that's on center line running fore and aft is how that's all fitted together with little wooden dowel joints between it, nicely made. Next slide.
Okay.
Just a nice shot of the bow. Again, I'm amazed, and I'm just so happy to have this in my collection. All that black paint, the gold paint, all the varnish is just all original and untouched. Very few chips on this thing. It's in really nice shape. Next slide.
Okay.
We're looking up towards the forward strut from underneath. Again, just showing you some details of how these fittings are put together, the nice joinery work that's made on these little fittings. Even that little bob stay that comes down there, that central centerline tension wire comes underneath. Look closely at that. Again, I'm just amazed at how someone took the time, rather than just having a piece of wood with a notch in it, they took the time to kind of flare it out to give it some sort of aesthetic beauty to it. Nicely done. Next slide is another detail of that cross arm.
Okay.
And next slide again is 25. This is one you should be seeing the crackle of the varnish on the deck here, and just a nice view of that forward connection. And then a little snap-on fitting of one of the forward shrouds coming into play. Next slide.
Okay.
Another shot at the central cross arm. Notice now as this goes in towards center line, mounted on that cross arm are also some fittings, some little cleats just to attach, in this case, jib sheet and such to them as well. Next slide.
Okay.
This photo is a little fuzzy, but it's the best I can do. So here you're actually seeing the springs. So if you look, there's two springs on the outboard end of that cross arm nice piece of mahogany. You can also see there on the photo on the left all the nicely little sculpted deck plates to tie off running rigging, sail running rigging and such as well around the mast deck. The next slide shows the tiller and these beautiful aesthetic cockpit seats that wrap around that teardrop-shaped cockpit. That's slide 31, and on slide 32, see on the right, the battens that are sewn in, those are all original. And then the next slide, 45, is before I owned the yacht, John Snow had this model, and I had my other Catamaran model at the Museum of Yachting in Newport, Rhode Island for a lovely show that took place some years ago that was on the history of vintage model yachts. So John had the pleasure at the time of having his yacht on display, and I had the pleasure of having my other fine yacht on display. got to get a sense of what the truss, what the hulls look like. Next slide. Slide 52 gives you a good sense. Again, central hulls, mahogany, two hulls, central truss, lots of jointed connections, and we're going to talk about this in detail. Next slide. A vantage from the bottom. What jumps out here, as I said, different from the earlier catamaran, was this has one centerboard, one rudder. And the rationale here is that as the hulls are bobbing around through the water, you want the sail plan to stay rigid with respect to the wind. You don't want your sail plan pitching back and forth. It wouldn't be very efficient. And the same is true for your centerboard and your rudder. You don't want them moving all around. You wouldn't have very efficient flow over there. So you want the hulls to absorb the motion of the waves while the thing that's creating all of your lift, your aerodynamic lift, your hydrodynamic lift, to be as steady as possible as moving across the pond. Next slide. This is the overall vantage showing the sail plan. Big, tall Marconi rig, 80 inches from the masthead to the top of the mast. And you can see it there hanging from my ceiling. Next slide. We're just going to fly around here. So here we're looking underneath from the stern. You can see the rudder. We'll talk about that a lot later. Brain steering here. The centerboard coming down, looking up at the hulls. Next slide. So this is a fun one. This is one of my favorites. I was taking the photos the other day. This is looking at the port bow, and that's just this beautiful, very thin mahogany planking that comes in. Each one of those little black dots is a little tiny wooden trundle. No nails, no screws, just little wooden dowels that go through. Each little wooden dowel is then split again to hold it in place, and it's just really tight planking on this thing. And those wooden dowels, wooden trundles, are going into little thin steam bed frames. This was all covered in fiberglass when I found it. We stripped it all down. We glossed it all up, and for fun, we added that nice gold borderline stripe you see on there. Next slide. Here we're on the porthole back aft, looking towards centerline. Again, you see the beautiful planking of the trundles. You're also going to see that sort of dark bronze-looking strut that sticks up. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Next slide, looking towards the bow. These decks on here have been replaced. As I said, when we found the model, it was all balsa. We ripped that off. We replaced those with mahogany. The spray rails, about a third of the way down the deck, those are original. And you can see two cockpits in each hull. And the function of the cockpits is to hold these struts that allow this articulated motion. And we'll talk about that further. Next slide. Looking a little more closely at that spray rail. And again, you can see these two cockpits with these struts coming from underneath. Next slide is back aft. That's the stern deck. Again, this nice mahogany. And if you look at the left part of that slide, you look down into what looks like a shock absorber, which in fact is exactly what it is. Next slide. This shows it in a little more detail. So you're looking inside the cockpit. You're seeing these steam bed frames. Actually, I say that. There are sawn major frames every so often, and then between them are steam bed frames. Little wooden truddles holding everything. And this is the key to the yacht. So this is a spring-loaded shock absorber. It can, like a piston, go up and down. It attaches the hull on that longitudinal shaft down at the bottom. So the hull is free to roll, heel on its own. There's nothing that stops the hull from rolling left or right. The shock absorber allows it to go up and down. And importantly, you can undo that little nut down at the bottom and take the entire hull, do this on the front and back strut, and move the entire hull forward and aft with respect to the shock absorber. So typically on a traditional pond yacht, you're changing the balance of the yacht by moving the mast position, right, relative to the hull. Here, the mast is all attached to the central strut, and you're changing the balance And then about an inch back from there is the jib tack fitting. And that has a little stay on it, which is not so much for rig tension, it's just where the hanks of the jib are attached to. So the rig is tension with the outside forestay, and then the second one is just simply an inner stay to attach the jib hanks. From underneath, you can see the front end of a tension wire that runs underneath the centerline truss. Next slide. Here's a little detail of that retrofit pivoting yoke. So you can see these darker colored beams are the things that were added to allow that central yoke to pivot, to allow the two holes to go up and down. Little jib trap there. Next slide. So there's inner and outer shrouds. They crisscross actually. The diagonal shrouds are stepped further outward on the cross arm, and the cap shrouds, the ones that go all the way up towards the top of the mast, are anchored with turnbuckles inboard. Next slide. Another view of shrouds and mast step area. Next slide. So this is where, again, my eye just goes in heaven every time I look at this. So this truss is built of all of these carefully thought through triangulated pieces of mahogany wood. And they all come together in these beautiful little sort of half-flat joints. There's little metal fittings that hold it all in place. It's incredibly strong for such a lightweight structure. I've had the holes removed, I've had the truss in my hand, and I've tried to flex it with my hands. Not the joints, but the rigid part in the middle. And it's amazing for how light this thing is and how strong all of those joints are. Next slide. Get a nice little detail showing how these fittings are made. Each joint is reinforced. Each joinery connection is reinforced with screws and little metal plates. All of this stuff is custom. Nothing on here was off the shelf. And again, I think I noted that Robert Patterson was a machinist himself, so I'm sure he had his little lathe, his little Bridgeport going and making a lot of this stuff. Next slide. We're starting to look further aft here on this truss. You can see off to the right the brain steering gear. We're looking down. Again, just beautiful little fittings. Next slide. We're on the starboard side looking aft. Again, you're beginning to come into the field of view what's going on with the rudder. We'll talk about that in a second. The rudder hangs low, and there are these rigid tension struts that help support the pintle point of the rudder. Next slide is the centerboard. It's a pivoting centerboard, so it can come fully up or just transport the model, or it can be pinned in any one of an up or down position depending upon the wind conditions or whether you're sailing upwind or downwind. So this is a telltale little piece of fun. So of course the centerboard needed a washer, and Patterson decided he wasn't going to use any washer. He grabbed a penny, a Lincoln cent penny, and as I zoom in onto that, I can make out the date 193, and then the last digit is a little fuzzy to see. It's either a 0 or a 3. So Patterson's son told me the model was built in the early 1930s. The penny tells me it's either 1930 or 1933. But I really kind of chuckle that Robert Patterson, who built it, was thoughtful enough to leave this little telltale sign by using a little penny as a washer here. The fitting on the right side there is a brass pin that comes out. And if you look at the holes just below that in the mahogany rudder, that allows, the centerboard, that allows the centerboard to pivot up, and you can lock that pin and set the centerboard in a certain downward angle, from all the way up or all the way down, or any one of those pin positions in between. Next slide. Top of the centerboard. Interestingly, that truss that runs fore and aft is off of center line. It's displaced slightly to port, so that the centerboard is on the true center line of the overall yacht. Patterson was thoughtful enough to do that. He wanted the centerboard on the middle, so he moved the strut that holds it off to the port side. Next slide is slide 80. We're looking at the starboard side of the centerboard there, and you can see the little pin that comes through the Next slide. A little detail of the jib traveler track, just in front of the mast. If you look down here, a little bit lower in that field of view, this mast is stepped into that brass assembly that takes the compression of the mast and then also is a holder for the fore and aft beam that holds the centerboard as well. So there's a lot going on in this one area. It's also the anchor for the pivot rod that the yoke that holds the hulls allow them to articulate. A lot going on in the central area. Next slide, you can see there on slide 86, that whole mast step assembly. Again, very creative how lots of different function taking place and the creativity that went to think how we build this little thing and have it accomplish all these different tasks. Next slide. This is my handiwork. The model, when I got it, did not have a gooseneck. That was missing. And so I took some brass and just made up a little pivoting gooseneck fitting for the boom. The boom is original, the sails are original, the mast is original. And again, I made some grommets for the tack fitting on the sail. Next slide. This is the back of the boom. Original little eyes there. Again, a little sewn in clue fitting on the mainsail. Next slide. Now we're looking up the rig. This is a spreader, a little bronze spreader. It's a single spreader rig. For stowage and transport, that spreader strut does pivot down, so the shrouds can sort of bend in as you take the whole mast and kind of put it in the back of a car or truck. There is a screw hole fitting just forward of that attachment fitting for the spreader. I have no idea what that's for. That may have been another baby or diamond shroud at one point, but I don't have any other evidence as to what was in that little screw hole. To the left there, you see one of the turnbuckles that holds the shrouds. Interestingly, these are custom made, and the thread size, like the thread count and the screw diameter, is no other match that I've ever found. I've tried many different screws in there. I've counted the thread count, and it's just a unique thing. I think Mr. Patterson went over to his lathe and just started turning screws, threads, and turnbuckles, and whatever information he dialed into his brickboard, that's what came out of his lathe. Next slide. Little kinks that hold the mainsail to a luff rope, a little wire luff rope. There is a jumper strut for the jib up higher on the mast. This is really fun. So I said the sails are unique, right? So they're stained, but there's no holes in them. And each sail has in pencil an original builder's little center of effort mark. So he took the straight edge, triangulated the center of effort as you would in a triangle thing, drew a little circle on it. So there was a lot of thought on his end that went into mapping out how all this design of this yacht was going to come together. But I'm so thrilled. Not only do I have original sails, but the original builder's little thought processes to calculating the center of effort. And that's my collection. Those are the two yachts side by side, flying in my ceiling. The hair shopping influence one in the back, very close to Nat's original models. The adaptive one, which was later 1930s, we know the builder on that is Robert Patterson. And there's a little follow-on. I mentioned I got into catamarans because a friend of mine gave me a model that he found in Long Island, not a coincidence, but in parallel. Let's go to the next slide. And that's what you see here hanging on the ceiling higher up in my house. This is a catamaran model, and only a portion of it. I have no rig. The central truss has been heavily degraded. I'm missing a lot of components of it. And for many years, I've had this in my possession and didn't really know what it was, didn't know where it came from. Well, when I met John Snow and I started talking to him, he started describing his catamaran model, which I now have. We were just sort of over the phone when we would meet, say, hey, my model's 45 inches long, yours is too. My model's 20 inches wide, yours is too. Well, it turns out we finally got them together one day, and they are essentially the exact same model, exact same proportion, dimensions, everything on it, except his is fully intact, and mine's sitting here looking for some TLC. The only difference on this one articulation on these models as I am. And with that, I'm happy to say thank you and open the floor to any questions.
If you have any questions, speak up and I'll try and repeat them so TJ can hear them.
Your turn for John to hear
Either of
you.
them seen the water?
Huh?
Have either of them seen the water?
Have either of the catamarans seen the water?
Yes, John has had his sailing a few times before I had possession of it, and I have sailed mine once at Red Pond in Marblehead, just once. I may be timid and I may be shy, but I wanted to prove to myself that it got wet when it sailed, and I may be a little too shy and bashful to keep doing that, so now it just flies above the ceiling in my house.
Other questions? Yes.
So, did I miss something, or was this a model that went along with the patent application for Herreshoff's larger real catamaran?
Did you hear that, TJ?
No.
The question was, was this one of the models that went along with the patent application for Herreshoff?
I don't know, right? So no, the faithful answer is no. I showed you the much smaller model that Herreshoff submitted with his patent application.
Oh, okay.
There is some thought that the green model in the background, which is heavily influenced by Herreshoff, might have been built by someone in the Herreshoff family or someone connected with the Herreshoff boat building company. I don't know that with any certainty. I wish I did. However, the model is so heavily influenced by Herreshoff and Herreshoff's thinking that I would be keen to hypothesize that there might be some connection. But no, it is not a patent model. The patent model is that much smaller thing that you saw in one of those early photos.
TJ, I have one question. It's John.
Yep.
The model that I showed you is ballasted with, I think, 3 or 4 pounds in each hull. Are either of these ballasted at all?
No, the only ballast there's no ballast in the Herreshoff influence one. Those are solid wood hulls. The yacht in freshwater does float reasonably on its lines. The mahogany one floats high of the gold waterline. That's a little above the water. The only ballast that's in the hulls is a little, I think, 2-ounce fishing weight that is in the port hull to normalize the weight between the two hulls. For whatever reason, there's a slight asymmetry, so I put a little 2-ounce fishing weight in that hull. But there's no other ballast per se in either of the models.
I wonder if that's because of the offset center beam.
I never thought about that.
No.
You never know.
Any questions? Sorry, I jumped in there.
One last one again.
One more.
So Herreshoff sounds Russian. Was he like a first-generation immigrant from Russia? Anybody know anything about him? Quickly?
Was Herreshoff a Russian immigrant?
No. No,
No.
TJ?
he's German.
I'm gonna have to get back on that. He certainly, his family was here. He did not come to the United States himself. He had family here that was here first, but I don't know if he was a first generation born American. I'm gonna have to look that one up.
I'll tell you in one
He
second.
seems to know.
Who?
Yeah,
This guy.
well, I read the
Herreshoff. Looking
Herreshoff
it up.
history book. He's German,
German.
German heritage, and he definitely was born in this country. I don't
German
know
heritage
how
born
far
in this
back
country.
generations go.
Yeah, sure.
Any other questions here? All right, TJ, thank you so much. It was a great presentation. I will be in touch.
Good. Well, I thank you all for your interest and listening, and it's certainly been my honor and pleasure to be able to share some of these fun models with all you guys there. So thank you so much.
They're great models, TJ. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you too.
So we have about 25 minutes before picnic dinner back over.